2017 edition of the Sustainable Materials Management Web Academy. We're happy to have you participating. This 90-minute webinar is hosted by US EPA to provide training and networking opportunity to state, local governments, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders interested in sustainable materials management. Today's EPA Open webinar will share the story of how the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality transitioned from a traditional solid waste focus on end-of-life discards to sustainable materials management. Sustainable materials management is a systematic approach to using and reusing materials more productively over their life cycles, their entire life cycles. It represents a change in how our society thinks about the use of natural resources and environmental protection. By looking at a product's entire life cycle, we can find new opportunities to reduce environmental impacts, conserve resources, and reduce costs. Note that EPA published the Sustainable Materials Management Road Ahead report in 2009. We welcome David Alloway and Elaine Blatt, our speakers for today, from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Elaine and David will highlight the department's journey, as well as Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emission inventory and Oregon's strategic plan for preventing wasting of food. We will take one or two burning questions after the first two sections of David's presentation, and then we'll have a longer question and answer session after the conclusion of the third session hosted by Elaine. Please feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar. Moving into today's webinar, please note our disclaimer. And now to our speakers. I have the pleasure to introduce our featured speakers from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Our first speaker, David Alloway, is a senior policy analyst with the Materials Management Program, where he coordinates a variety of projects related to materials, including waste management, sustainable production, consumption, greenhouse gases, and life cycle analysis. David is a leader in sustainable production and consumption elements, both in Oregon and nationally, and it's a pleasure to have him join us today. Our second speaker is Elaine Blatt, a senior policy analyst as well from the Oregon Department of Quality, and her primary focus is the sustainable consumption and production of materials with a focus on preventing the wasting of food. David and Elaine, I turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. Can you, just to confirm, can you hear us okay and see our slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So, hello everyone. This is David Alloway of the Oregon DEQ, and with me is my colleague Elaine Blatt. We appreciate you spending some time with us today. Our presentation today has three parts to it. First, I'm going to talk broadly and at a fairly high level about Oregon's transition from discards management to sustainable materials management. I'll clarify what sustainable materials management, or SMM, means to us and how, over the course of the last 5 years, we've significantly reoriented our work. We'll then make a deeper exploration of two specific projects. I'll introduce Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and then Elaine will talk about our new strategy for preventing the wasting of food. So let's get started with the story of how the state of Oregon came to abandon its solid waste framework in favor of this concept of sustainable materials management. As a journey, I think it is best described in four different eras. First, our early years, in which Oregon DEQ focused primarily on recycling and disposal, but over the years came to realize the limitations of that approach. Next, the development of Oregon's 2050 vision for materials management. Then, a period in which we developed initial legislation to implement the 2050 vision, and a current period in which we're now implementing programs in response to that legislation. I'm going to talk about each of these stages in turn. In 1983, Oregon's legislature adopted major solid waste legislation that included a formal policy endorsement of the waste management hierarchy. Reduce waste first, then reuse, and only then recycle, then recover energy. Prevention and reuse were supposed to be the priorities, but for many years received little more than lip service. However, the state agency responsible for solid waste programs, Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality, was an entity with broad environmental perspective and authority, as opposed to being a solid waste or public works department. The agency's interest in broader environmental considerations would come into play later. Also, solid waste policy in Oregon, including a number of recycling initiatives, were motivated as much by interest in resource conservation and pollution reduction as it was by landfill avoidance. For decades now, Oregon has enjoyed hundreds of years of permitted landfill disposal capacity, so our programs have been less motivated by landfill avoidance and more about broader environmental goals. During the 1990s, the state made very significant strides in recycling and composting, but a policy review in 2000 highlighted that even as waste recovery rates had risen dramatically, overall waste generation had risen sharply as well. In other words, Oregon was doing well with recycling and composting, but not prevention or reuse. In response, the 2001 legislature both updated the statewide waste recovery goal, but also adopted a parallel statutory goal to reduce overall waste generation. Not disposal, but generation, total discards, a goal that could only be achieved through prevention and reuse. And this gave new impetus to move to some efforts that moved us up the hierarchy. We implemented a number of pilot projects, and as part of those pilot projects, commissioned 3 life cycle analyses involving e-commerce packaging, drinking water delivery, and single-family housing. These LCAs blew apart our understanding of the environmental impacts of materials and challenged a lot of deeply held beliefs. While confirming the environmental benefits of recycling, they also illustrated the limitations of recycling and a potential benefit from prevention that was a factor of 10 times greater. They also showed that popular product attributes such as recyclable and recycled content don't always lead to material choices that have the lowest overall environmental impact. Climate change also became a big issue in Oregon policy in the mid-2000s, and a series of studies showed the significant climate impacts of materials and the importance of viewing materials through a comprehensive lens that considers their full life cycle as opposed to focusing only on disposal stage impacts. And finally, in 2009, EPA published this very important document here, Sustainable Materials Management, The Road Ahead. It defined sustainable materials management and called on states to take a broader and more holistic view of materials. So the stage was set for change. So let's step back a moment and clarify what sustainable materials management means. Many people in the waste community wrongly assume that sustainable materials management is simply a new branding of the waste management hierarchy, or perhaps a code word for circular economy or zero waste. But if you read EPA's definitions, one of which I'm showing here, it should be clear that sustainable materials management is much broader than solid waste management, broader than circular economy, and broader than zero waste, or at least as it's commonly understood, zero solid waste. SMM is an approach to serving human needs by using and reusing resources productively and sustainably throughout their life cycles, generally minimizing the amount of materials involved and all associated environmental impacts. So it includes solid waste and the impacts of solid waste, but is broader than both. So I sometimes describe materials management this way. This graphic shows the full life cycle of materials, and materials management basically concerns itself with reducing environmental impacts everywhere in this life cycle by taking actions anywhere and everywhere across the life cycle. Materials management then is a very large tent, and solid waste management shares that tent with what is sometimes called sustainable production and consumption, or in shorthand, upstream. Again, and to confirm, when Oregon talks about sustainable materials management, we're not talking about circular economy or zero waste. And we are most definitely not talking about goals of landfill diversion or landfill avoidance. Because when we quantify the environmental impacts of materials, it's clear that the environmental impacts of production and consumption dwarf those of disposal, at least in this country. And focusing on disposal not only leads to a much smaller toolbox of options, it also leads to actions that are sometimes perverse, penny-wise but pound-foolish. Materials have huge impacts to the environment, but most of these impacts are upstream. In our experience, framing this problem through the lens of solid waste lends most people to solutions that are less impactful and less beneficial. Now, one more thing that sustainable materials management isn't. It isn't about going upstream for the sole purpose of making wastes more recyclable. That's another common misunderstanding. Again, the ultimate goal here is not to keep stuff out of landfills or to recycle more. Recycling and landfill avoidance, if done right, can align and do align with the goals of sustainable materials management. But those goals are environmental benefits across the full life cycle. And sometimes recyclable materials are better than non-recyclable ones, but not always. There are many examples I could use to illustrate this, but for the sake of time, I'm going to use a simple one, and one that was actually developed by the US EPA. Here's a comparison of 3 different options for packaging instant coffee. You could package instant coffee in a recyclable steel can, a recyclable plastic tub, or a difficult to recycle or non-recyclable flexible pouch. The other columns show the energy requirements, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the solid waste generation. Choose your metric. The flexible pouch is always the winner, even though it can't be recycled. Whether you care about conserving energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or reducing solid waste generation, the flexible pouch is the best performer. If you adhere to a rigid mandate that says, no, all materials must be recyclable, then you'd end up preferring the steel can or the plastic tub. You'll have an easier time achieving your recycling goals, and you may feel really good about that. But you'll end up using more energy, emitting more greenhouse gases, and producing more solid waste. So, why are we recycling in the first place? If we recycle in order to conserve energy, reduce pollution, and reduce waste, then we need to keep those objectives first and foremost in our minds. And that's what sustainable materials management aims to do. Ultimately, sustainable materials management draws its inspiration from facts and science. It's not bound to dogma or theory. It aims to understand materials holistically across their full life cycle, and its overarching goal is to reduce environmental impacts writ large, as opposed to just reducing solid waste disposal or recycling more. And so this leads to a very different suite of actions and priorities than traditional solid waste management programs. Why choose this approach? Because, again, most of the environmental impacts of materials are upstream, and so taking a more holistic view not only leads to more informed and better environmental outcomes, it also allows us to achieve more public benefit with our limited public dollars. So back to our journey. State law requires DEQ to periodically update the state's solid waste management plan. And the last plan, written in 1994, was intended to run through 2005. 2011 rolls around, our plan is 6 years out of date, and DEQ sets out to update it. But staff and management here had learned, through the evolution I described a few minutes ago, of the value of this more holistic view. DEQ, after all, is an environmental agency, not a solid waste or public works department. We were inspired by EPA's road ahead, and we wanted to explore what a state plan for sustainable materials management would look like. There were no real examples to draw from. So in 2011, we convened some of our state's best thinkers and a few out-of-state guests for 5-day-long meetings. The result was this document here, Materials Management in Oregon, 2050 Vision and Framework for Action. If you want to see a state plan for sustainable materials management, one that includes solid waste management, but isn't organized around the hierarchy, and one that doesn't give solid waste top billing, check this out. It's a quick read, less than 50 pages with a lot of big print. We also did a lot of research and published a suite of background papers. And I don't like to boast, but I really think that many of these papers developed by our team here are exceptional. Just a quick note, our agency website is being totally reorganized later this month, so these 2 URLs here are only good for a few more days. We'll provide our emails at the end, and if you can't find these documents, just send me or Elaine an email, and depending on when we receive it, we'll give you the correct URL. The 2050 Vision and Framework for Action defines a path to work holistically across the entire life cycle of materials, and it consists of 2 parts, the vision and the framework for action. The vision itself is shown here. Oregonians in 2050 produce and use materials responsibly, conserving resources, protecting the environment, living well. This is our compass. It points us to what we're working to achieve. The framework for action tells us the types of work needed to realize the vision. Not all the details are filled in. We don't even know all the details, and it will require periodic updates as we make progress and move towards the vision. The document was endorsed by our program's key stakeholders and then adopted by our state's Environmental Quality Commission in late 2012. And with that, we were formally on our way to becoming a materials management program. But there were still some major factors holding us and our partners back. So we spent the better part of the next 2 years working with our stakeholders on several legislative concepts. And these were introduced in 2015 as 2 bills, Senate Bills 245 and 263. After a fair amount of negotiation and changes, both bills passed and were signed by our governor in the summer of 2015. Together, the bills run about 34 pages, so I'll just summarize a few of the highlights. Probably most importantly, the bills strengthen DEQ's legal authority to pursue sustainable materials management across the full life cycle of materials, and they restored and stabilized long-term funding for our program. Senate Bill 263 also updated Oregon's existing solid waste laws. It increased recycling requirements of certain local governments, and it created a new set of waste prevention and reuse requirements for larger local governments. The bill modestly increased Oregon's statewide waste recovery goal and adopted a very ambitious goal to reduce overall solid waste generation. Again, that emphasizes prevention and reuse. The bill created statewide waste recovery goals for 3 specific materials: plastics, food waste, and carpet, where analysis indicated large potential for energy or greenhouse gas benefits. And the bill also requires that Oregon changes the way it counts recovery. The current system, like most other states, is denominated in tons. In this way, all waste recovery is the same, even though, for example, recycling a ton of aluminum leads to a very different environmental outcome than, say, composting a ton of leaves. The legislation maintains the traditional weight-based approach while requiring the state to develop a parallel accounting called outcome-based recovery, where different recovery activities will contribute more or less to recovery goals, depending on whether they contribute more or less to environmental outcomes, such as energy conservation or greenhouse gas reduction. These bills were adopted in mid-2015, and new revenue started coming into our program only about 7 months ago. So we're now in a new place. We're a materials management program that happens to have a heavy institutional history in solid waste. We have new authority, new direction, and some new staff and resources. So, what are we doing? In case you think that we may have given up on traditional solid waste management, the answer is most definitely no. We still permit and we regulate solid waste disposal facilities. We're continuing one of the nation's best waste composition studies. Oregon has a comprehensive set of policies that provides recycling opportunities to a broad swath of our state's population, encourages private sector involvement, and provides a stable funding mechanism for local recycling programs. We're also making new investments in food and plastics waste recovery, household hazardous waste, multifamily recycling, and contamination reduction. But to give you a flavor of some new and different work that may be less familiar to other states and traditional waste management programs, we're also conducting additional research into popular product attributes, such as biodegradable and recycled content, to determine when these attributes correlate with actual environmental benefits and when they don't. We're helping to create a market for low-carbon concrete by providing all concrete manufacturers in Oregon with free access to a tool that enables them to evaluate and disclose the carbon content of different concrete mixes. And we're also reimbursing a portion of independent third-party verification of those claims, which are called environmental product declarations. Through the West Coast Forum on Climate and Materials Management, we've supported the creation of a climate-friendly purchasing toolkit for governments that has some really rich information in it. We've also participated in the creation of a sustainable consumption toolkit for cities. We're publishing a series of informational summaries on the environmental impacts of different foods, summaries that are intended to help producers and purchasers understand where the biggest impacts are, and by extension, how they might prioritize their actions to reduce those impacts. We're supporting a variety of policies, incentives, and outreach efforts to build the market for smaller, or sometimes called space-efficient, housing. And we've just published a major study and strategic plan on reuse, repair, and extending the lifespan of products. We're now supporting workforce development programs for reuse, funding building material reuse and deconstruction services across the state, and looking to support remanufacturing and textile repair. These are all examples of projects that aren't primarily about solid waste or landfill avoidance. Their goals are broader, and they engage different partners, often earlier in the life cycle of materials. Each of these projects would probably fill a webinar, but we don't have time. So next, Elaine and I will share with you the details of two other projects, Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory and a pending strategic plan for preventing the wasting of food. But let's stop here for a minute and take a few burning questions. Chris?
Hi. Thank you so much, David. Much appreciated. We had a lot of questions about your example of the coffee can. So can you just maybe flip back to that slide and go over that just one more time? Folks were asking about its recyclability, some questions about the lid, and then a lot of questions about the flexible packaging. Maybe you could just talk to the quick issue about, well, quick is not the right answer, the issue of flexible packaging and how that's becoming problematic in the recycling stream. So just go over that example a little bit again.
Of course, great, thank you. So again, this is the short summary of a larger EPA analysis, and I'll mention there are other examples like this, but this one is pretty well understood. And so it looks at three different options for packaging instant coffee. We won't go into instant coffee versus non-instant coffee, but if you're going to package instant coffee, the three primary formats available are the steel can that has a plastic lid that is not recyclable in most recycling programs, or there's a plastic tub with a plastic lid that is also not recyclable in most programs, or there's this flexible pouch. And EPA's evaluation looked at the energy used over the life cycle of these materials, including energy credits for recycling, the first two, because the first two are commonly accepted in many municipal curbside programs. Also included the energy required to send the flexible pouch off to disposal, as well as the fraction of the steel cans, the plastic containers, and the lids that are not recycled, because not everybody recycles them. Looked at the greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle, and looked at the amount of municipal solid waste generation. And so there are the results. I think they speak for themselves. And the moral of the story is that just because something is recyclable and recycled, for that matter, doesn't necessarily make it the best choice for the environment. And I could offer a really kind of silly but extreme example of this, and that involves mercury. Moving away from coffee for a moment, mercury as a material is very recyclable. It's very easy to recycle it. It costs a bit, but you can do it. But just because it's recyclable doesn't mean it's something that we want in our homes or in our products. So it's a bit of an extreme example, but I think it illustrates the shortcomings of assuming that if materials are recyclable, they are inherently good, and if materials are not recyclable, they are inherently bad. So this flexible pouch is not recyclable, although there are some pilot projects, underway to try to do energy recovery or redesign them so they could be recycled. And if they could be recycled, and if MRFs could handle them and they could flow through the system without upsetting the recycling processing system, that would be an improvement. But even barring that technological advance and change to our infrastructure, today, given current infrastructure, if you're a coffee manufacturer and you're looking to choose the packaging that has the lowest environmental impact for your instant coffee, the flexible pouch appears to offer environmental advantages over the more recyclable steel can and plastic container.
Thank you. Such an illustrative example. One last question I have from some colleagues here in the Northeast. How does DEQ set priorities given the new world of SMM? Your project examples cover a wide range of activities, many that are not traditionally recycling and solid waste. And how do you justify your focus?
Well, that's a great question. So we justify the broader focus on the full life cycle of materials using some of the examples I've shared in this webinar and many others which are referenced in the 2050 vision if you go back and you look at the endnotes. And so that justifies the broader focus. And then within this huge universe, because it's a very big universe, how do we prioritize the work and the materials? Well, it's really a mixture of a number of criteria that include what the environmental impacts are. So in a perfect world, we would focus on materials that have higher impacts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next segment when we get into the consumption-based emissions inventory that informs some of our material selection. But not only do we need to focus on materials that have environmental impacts, we need to focus on materials where we can actually do something about those impacts. So concrete is a great example. Concrete has a very high carbon footprint, and it's also really easy to reduce it. So it makes it a really good candidate. So we look for those sorts of wins. But we also look for materials and products where we have partners or potential partners that are likely to help us move the ball forward. And sometimes they're leading and we're just supporting. So we're somewhat opportunistic in that we're looking for situations where the field is right. In the concrete project, for example, the field was right to work on that because of the new standard for LEED version 4, which now gives points to projects, building projects that have these environmental product declarations. So there was a market pull for this sort of analysis. We also prioritize work in part based on what our core competencies are and where our experience is. There's some work we'd like to do that we just don't know how to do it. And a lot of the recycling work we're doing because we know how to do it. We have decades of experience with recycling. We're pretty good at it. And a lot of our more traditional, long-standing stakeholders really want us to be doing that sort of work as well. So that also comes into the equation. So it's a pretty complex and diverse set of criteria that cause us to choose which projects to prioritize.
Well, thank you so much, and let's go into this section 2 of your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Just a moment here. Just had to consume a little bit of water there, so here we go. So among our current portfolio of projects, the consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory is an atypical project to highlight, in part because it actually predates adoption of the 2050 vision, if only by a year or two. In fact, the results of this inventory help to both inform and inspire our shift to full life cycle materials management. But it's an initiative that is also continued, and in fact, we're scheduled to launch a major update in the next few months. So let me back up for a moment and get us all on the same page regarding greenhouse gas inventories at the community scale. State and local governments inventory greenhouse gases for a variety of reasons. Typically, this includes establishing a baseline that can be used to measure progress. Inventories identify sources of emissions and trends in those emissions. And this information informs climate-related planning efforts and projects, both by the local government and community partners. Inventories can inform development of emissions reduction policy and targets. And results are commonly used to communicate with both policymakers and the general public. Now, the consumption-based inventory is very different from how Oregon historically inventoried its greenhouse gas emissions, and different from what most other states have done as well. So to set the stage, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about conventional greenhouse gas emissions inventories. The framework that almost all states use for inventorying their greenhouse gases is often called the in-boundary approach. It's also called the snow globe approach. Basically, it's an accounting of all the emissions that physically originate within a state's borders, as if an imaginary snow globe covered each state, and we could just capture all the emissions within it. In recent years, many states have modified their in-boundary approach to include the emissions from electricity that they import for in-state use. And this establishes a very important precedent, whereby many states have agreed to include in their inventory emissions that don't physically originate inside their state's boundaries, but rather are caused by economic activities in their state. The consumption-based inventory, as Oregon has developed it, simply takes this logic one step further. The traditional in-boundary snow globe approach to inventorying emissions has a lot of merits, and I would never recommend discontinuing it. But it does have a few limitations that are worth noting. Primarily, it provides an incomplete perspective of how states and communities contribute to emissions, and by extension, opportunities to reduce those emissions. And this is particularly acute for materials, where many of the materials used within cities and states are produced in other places, and most of their greenhouse gas impact, not impact, but emissions, are emissions that originate in those other communities. So that's what really drew the materials management program at DEQ to this inventory approach. The traditional inventory approach also appears to penalize local production and reward outsourcing. So for example, if your state is home to a major emitter, a major industry, and it shuts down and moves to someplace like, I don't know, India or China, and takes its emissions with it, your traditional inventory approach would reward that as, it would recognize that as victory, as success, because your state's emissions have gone down, when in fact, globally, emissions have not gone down. Potentially, they've even gone up, depending on where the technology has moved to. So, this is really not very wise from a climate perspective, since greenhouse gases are a global pollutant. And this approach can also lead to suboptimal decisions, and a classic example of this is recycling. The primary greenhouse gas benefit of recycling is in providing industry with materials that displace virgin feedstocks and allow for a reduction in those emissions. But the industries that use our recyclables are often not located in the city or the state where the recyclables are collected. So certain folks in the inventory community would argue that since community recycling doesn't reduce community scale emissions, that is, the emissions of the inbound reinventory, recycling doesn't really count at all, and therefore recyclers shouldn't have a seat at the climate table. Or worse, since collecting recyclables is a local activity that burns fuel inside the community, and that does increase the community's inbound emissions, then community scale recycling and recycling collection should be discontinued. Finally, this traditional inboundary approach by itself can provide very misleading signals of change over time, as demonstrated in the United Kingdom, where for many years their inboundary inventory was decreasing, the nation was claiming credit for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, when in fact most of the emissions reductions were a consequence of outsourcing of industry brought on by globalization, and in fact the nation's consumption-based emissions were actually rising. Now, the consumption-based inventory is not limited to the consumption of materials, but one of its primary values is in shining some light on the impacts of materials. Most of the materials consumed in Oregon, or rather consumed by Oregon, were not made in state. Like this Sonicare toothbrush, the supply chain extends into Washington state, China, Japan, France, Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Sweden, and Austria. Buying this toothbrush, or any product or service for that matter, sends economic signals that ripple out through the global economy, signals that result in the very greenhouse gas emissions that threaten Oregon's environment, even if these emissions themselves do not physically originate within our state's borders. A consumption-based inventory shines a light on how local consumption drives global emissions. So what is a consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory? In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss the methodology, but it is described in a report that you can download from our website. Estimating these emissions is not easy, and until recently, many skeptics believed it to be impossible. Oregon, to our knowledge, was the first subnational entity in the United States to commission a consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and we did so with the great assistance of the Stockholm Environment Institute U.S. Center. Basically, this inventory estimates the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from consumption, where consumption is defined in economic terms as purchases by consumers, and consumers, consistent with international standards for national economic accounting, are defined as households, governments, and one category of business expenditures, which is capital formation or the increase in inventory. Consumption is significant because it is the root driver of emissions. While many greenhouse gas emissions occur from industry, industry does not produce goods for the sake of producing those goods. It produces those goods because consumers are demanding them through price signals in the marketplace. And so many economists would support this claim that consumption is significant because it is fundamentally the root driver of not only economic activity, but greenhouse gases as well. And so the consumption-based inventory gives us insight into the root causes of these emissions. In a consumption-based inventory, emissions are life cycle emissions, and they're globally distributed. They include emissions inside Oregon, although not all the emissions in Oregon, but they also include emissions in other states and nations. And by life cycle, I mean they include supply chain, production, use, and disposal. And the consumption-based inventory includes, but is not limited to, materials. It includes fuels, electricity, and services consumed by the community. Our initial work on this was 5 years ago, and today most state and local greenhouse gas inventories still only take the modified in-boundary approach. But things are starting to change. King County, Washington, and San Francisco both followed Oregon and developed consumption-based inventories at about the same time, and then they were followed by the cities of Portland and Eugene. In late 2015, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, working with the wizards at UC Berkeley, came out with a report estimating consumption-based emissions for more than 100 different cities in the San Francisco area. Minnesota is developing a consumption-based emissions inventory, and now the C40, which is a network of 80 large cities around the world, is in the process of developing consumption-based inventories for all of its members. So this is an approach that you're likely going to be seeing more of in the coming years. So what do these consumption-based inventories look like? Here's a few results from Oregon. This graph here takes our consumption-based emissions and organizes them according to 4 major categories of consumption: materials, services, fuel, and electricity. You can see that the direct consumption of materials contributes more to our consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions than the direct consumption of fuels and electricity combined. And this really runs contrary to popular wisdom. Now, this is important to note. Many of the emissions associated with the consumption of materials are due to industry's use of fuels and electricity. So this isn't to say that fuels and electricity aren't important, but rather, viewed through the lens of consumer actions, the materials we're consuming are a very significant driver of greenhouse gas emissions. Here's a bit more detail. Our most current inventory for 2014 is built on an economic model that divides the economy into 440 different types of commodities. Results are then calculated at the level of each commodity, then rolled up into 60-something different subcategories, which are then rolled up even further into 16 broad categories, which I'm just showing here. Although, because the graph would be too busy, I've taken the 10 smallest categories and clumped them together. The moral of this story here is that of these 16 broad categories, just 3 of them contribute almost half of all consumption-based emissions: vehicles and parts, appliances, which include home furnaces, and food and beverage. Most, although not all, of the emissions associated with vehicles and appliances occur during the use phase. In contrast, food and beverage emissions are dominated by production. There's already a lot of programs at both the state and federal and local level addressing vehicles and vehicle emissions as well as appliances, energy efficiency. But there's relatively less action involving food. So Chris, one of the questions you asked was, how do we prioritize our work? This is one of the studies that points us in the direction of food and motivates our work both on food waste prevention and that food product footprinting work I mentioned earlier, as well as food recovery. Food contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's an area that doesn't have quite as much activity happening in it. So it's an area that's ripe for development. Looking at which life cycle stages contribute the most to emissions, most of the consumption-based emissions are upstream of the consumer in resource extraction and manufacturing, and to a smaller extent transportation. Those are all shown in blue. The direct use of electricity and fuels, both for heating and transport, contributes a significant share. Disposal emissions are small and have declined between 2005 and 2014. Now, one of the interesting outputs of our inventory are emissions intensities. And these are an estimate of the greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of consumption. And while we have them for all 440 commodities in our model, here I've rolled them up into our 4 broad meta categories of materials, electricity, fuels, and services. You can see that $1 spent on electricity in Oregon in 2010 contributed about 7.2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, almost twice as much as the same dollar being spent on fuel. Materials and services, on average, have lower emissions intensities, although not lower overall emissions, if you recall from this graph here. So what does this mean? Just a reminder, these are averages, and there are materials, specific materials and services, for example, beef and airplane travel, that have much higher emissions intensities than the average is shown here. Now, emissions intensities are particularly important for informing waste prevention efforts and for understanding the rebound effect. The rebound effect is what occurs when a consumer engages in a conservation practice that saves them money. For example, I install an energy-efficient furnace and my natural gas bill goes down. What do I do with those savings? Well, maybe I spend some of them by turning the thermostat up a degree or two, and that would be an example of a direct rebound effect. Or maybe I take the savings and I spend some of them at a restaurant, which would be an indirect rebound effect. The rebound effect explains why conservation isn't necessarily bad for the economy. Money still circulates. It just circulates in different ways. But it also explains why conservation programs don't always yield the benefits that are quite as large as advertised. Emissions intensities are an output of the consumption-based inventory and help shed some light on this very important and often overlooked dynamic. When it comes to materials, clothing and food are two broad categories that have emissions intensities that are fairly high, and this makes them priority candidates for waste prevention efforts because they'll likely result in smaller relative rebound effects. That is, if consumers buy less clothing or food, they'll save money. We don't know how they'll spend those savings or if they'll spend the savings at all, but we have a higher probability of achieving a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's one reason that our newly adopted strategic plan for reuse, repair, and product lifespan extension identifies clothing as a priority focus area. And also one reason why we're emphasizing preventing the wasting of food, which Elaine will get to in just a moment. Just to compare how the in-boundary and consumption-based inventories compare, this is for 2010, you can see that Oregon's consumption-based emissions are about 15% larger than our in-boundary emissions. And while there's considerable overlap, more than half of the emissions in the consumption-based inventory are not occurring inside Oregon. That's the 40.2 million metric tons on the right. These are the out-of-state emissions that we share some responsibility for, emissions that are not revealed or identified if we used only an in-boundary inventory. Put differently, these are the added emissions, and by extension, opportunities for emissions reductions that the consumption-based inventory introduces to the discussion. One side note, the relative scale of the in-boundary and consumption-based inventories varies by jurisdiction. For the world as a whole, in-boundary and consumption-based emissions are the same because we don't import or export from other planets. Conversely, scaling down to the level of counties or cities, the inventories can diverge dramatically. San Francisco, Portland, and King County, Washington have all done consumption-based inventories and have found them to be around 4 times larger than their in-boundary inventories, just because these cities are significant importers of goods and services. So what are some of the ways in which a consumption-based inventory can be used? It can identify the types of consumption that contribute a lot to emissions, as well as types of consumption that have higher emissions intensities. And it's consumption with high emissions intensity that should be the focus of waste prevention or conservation efforts. The inventory approach can form the basis of communication to consumers. We've used the consumption-based inventory to research several questions that have come up around carbon footprint of different materials. And we've also believed that adding the consumption-based perspective helps to improve the overall credibility of inventory and climate protection efforts because it tells a more complete story. We've modified our consumption-based inventory model to be used to help governments in Oregon conduct Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions inventories, which help to focus and prioritize their government purchasing efforts. And finally, you might assume that consumption-based inventories would be helpful at tracking changes over time, but this is where they fall a little bit short. Indeed, a good portion of the underlying data on economic consumption is not easily available at the community scale. So communities typically end up using modeled estimates. These estimates typically don't account for certain types of changes in consumption that occur at the local scale over time. So while the consumption-based approach is good at shining a light on emissions that are often overlooked, including many of the emissions from materials, it's not as useful at tracking real change over time. Despite these challenges, Oregon sees enough value in the approach that we've committed to a full update every 5 years and light or partial updates in intervening years as resources allow. And while this started out as a process project that was separate from the inbound reinventory, we've now married them together into an integrated report. The report is shown here. It's not particularly beautiful. We have a 2005 inventory produced by our consultant that has a summary report written for policymakers and the general public. It's a very, very nice read. And I'd also encourage you to check out the King County 2008 emissions inventory and the City of Portland's most recent climate action plan. Both of these report consumption-based emissions alongside traditional in-boundary emissions, and they both do a really excellent job with readability and visual appeal. So in conclusion, consumption-based inventories, along with in-boundary inventories, offer unique perspectives on how states and communities contribute to emissions and opportunities to reduce them. They are not a substitute for each other. You really need to do both, but they do lead states to a wider range of options. Greenhouse gases are a global pollutant, and ignoring these transboundary emissions tells an incomplete story of our shared responsibility to reduce those emissions. And consumption is particularly important as the root driver of emissions. I will just close by saying that this approach, the inventory itself, and the types of programs and policies that might stem from it, is still a very young field. I think that perhaps we're just wrapping up the kindergarten stage of development. So while we have a tremendous amount of original learning to do, we're going to be trying and testing new approaches. It's fun to work in this space because we don't have a playbook. We don't know exactly what to do or how to do it. And so it allows for a refreshing degree of creativity. And if consumption-based accounting is appealing to any of you, I offer this point as both a warning and an opportunity of sorts. We're all charting new ground here, and the field is still quite young. So I'd be happy to take perhaps one question before we move on to Elaine's presentation. Thank you.
Great. So we had, just looking at the question box, David, we have many, many, many questions about services. So I think we'll just punt to that one. Tell us more about the services category, some specific examples. Accounting service is something I'm not familiar with. Can you say more about it? How is it counted? An example of something that falls into that. That was by far the biggest question.
Great, yeah, okay. So services include all the things that consumers buy that are not materials, fuels, or electricity. So examples of this would include doctor's visits, hospitalizations, movie theater tickets, UPS, airplane tickets, airplane travel. In our graph here, there's a couple of services that are debatable as to whether or not they're services or materials. Restaurants. When you go to a restaurant and you spend money, is that a service or is it a material? Construction and remodeling, you're not doing it yourself, you're hiring someone to provide the service to you. So that's, and we sort of split the difference here and took those service materials and sort of cut them in half. They show up half in services and half in materials. But those are examples of services. Accounting, massages, haircuts, pedicures, veterinary visits, you name it. Those are all examples of services. And we account for them in this model the same way we account for everything else. We have an economic model that estimates the dollar expenditures, how much consumers spend on those different kinds of services. And we run them through the model and the emissions intensities just like anything else.
Great. Thank you so much. So now we're going to welcome Elaine, our second speaker, who's going to talk to us about wasted food and where Oregon's going with that. So Elaine, please.
Chris. So I'm going to linger for a moment on this beautiful picture of the Columbia River Gorge because we're about to go here to a discussion of our work here in the state of Oregon around the preventing of the wasting of food. I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking about our work in this area, and first I want to spend some time talking about our philosophy and approach to this issue, and then I'm going to take a few minutes to give you a preview of the strategic plan we've developed for the preventing of wasting of food. But before I go any further, I just want to talk a little bit about a language issue. Throughout this presentation, and I think as you also heard in David's presentation, we refer to the wasting of food and to wasted food. This is an intentional use of language. And while DEQ is primarily known for its science focus, we also believe that words matter. And in this context, historically, the problem of food waste has been understood as a matter of acceptable disposal, often focused on diversion from landfills, rather than a problem of wasted resources and wasted nutrients. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the term wasted food rather than food waste, because waste as a verb, in our opinion, calls attention to the act of discarding a valuable resource, in this instance food, in contrast to the noun food waste, which tends to focus attention on disposal solutions. And disposal solutions are something that I'll be addressing in much more detail in the next few minutes. But before we get started on the solutions, I think you all know that wasted food is a big problem, but for those of you who don't live in this world as I do every day, I wanted to provide a few bits of data. It's estimated that anywhere between 25% and 40% of food produced or imported into the United States is wasted. And to give you a sense of what that means, if all of that food were grown on one collective farm, that farm would be larger than the state of New Mexico. According to a national collaborative effort addressing wasted food, growing food on this huge wasteful farm would consume all of the water used in California, Texas, and Ohio combined, and the farm would harvest enough food to fill a 40-ton tractor trailer every 20 seconds. So that's a lot of wasted food. And what can we do to address it? And that was the primary question that we were addressing here in the state of Oregon. Not surprisingly, we looked back at the waste prevention hierarchy that David talked about earlier in his presentation as well. And it turns out that what's true for materials, other materials is also true for food. Reduce over reuse, which we call rescue here, and recover over disposal. So this diagram probably looks pretty familiar to most of you. It's based on the food recovery diagram hierarchy that EPA uses. We've made a few modifications here to tailor this diagram to the way we think about these issues here in Oregon. We've categorized, as you'll note, a good chunk of the middle part of the hierarchy as recovery, because we want to be aware of the recovery of the valuable resources that are embedded in food. And then we refer to food collected to feed hungry people as rescue, again focused on the value of that food as food, but we'll be talking a bit more about all this a bit later. And then also, spoiler alert as to where this conversation is going, we've made the source reduction section bigger than all the other layers. So the bottom line here is that the hierarchy that we all have come to know and love simply makes environmental sense when it comes to thinking about the wasting of food. And here's the reason why. This is greenhouse gas emissions data from EPA's waste reduction model. We all know that landfilling organic waste is a bad thing. And there you can see, documented in this graph, the greenhouse gas impacts on the right-hand side. So, you know, the fact that we're trying to keep organics out of landfills is a very good thing. If you go further to the left on the graph, you will see that composting and anaerobic digestion are obviously superior to landfilling. But what I want to do is direct your attention to the far left. Look what's better still, and by a long shot, source reduction. In fact, greenhouse gas reductions that could be achieved through source reduction are 6 times greater than recycling that same wasted food through composting, and 7 times greater than putting that wasted food through an anaerobic digester. And bear in mind that this graph only covers greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't account for the impacts of chemical fertilizers and pesticides or water use. Remember that New Mexico-sized farm and its water use, and also land use associated with food production. So while the impacts of food in landfills certainly deserve our attention, it's only by looking across the entire life cycle of food that we can appreciate its impacts and really figure out where we need to go. So back to the hierarchy. Even though the data show us that source reduction is superior, and even though I know that all of you actually already know this and have known it for some time, we're still stuck at the bottom to middle parts of the hierarchy. The vast majority of current efforts around wasted food focus on rescue and recovery. Because the greenhouse impacts of landfilling are well documented and wasted food is easy to see when you dump it in your garbage, our primary response to the problem of wasted food has been to frame the problem as a disposal problem, and therefore to focus on diverting it from landfills. Out of landfill, out of mind, so to speak. So anyway, as we just saw in the EPA WARN data information, a good chunk of the problem we face is the upstream impacts of wasted food, which are largely invisible. We simply don't see all the production inputs, the chemicals, the fertilizer, the pesticides, or the transportation, or the energy for cold storage, or even the energy to run the retailer where you buy your food, all these inputs that are wasted when food isn't eaten. So we're stuck in rescue and recovery. Just to reiterate, framing the issue of wasted food as a landfill problem and not as a materials management problem. And this is simply not a good thing. By focusing on the end-of-life impacts and emphasizing diversion, we are inadvertently telling people, as long as you keep it out of the landfill, it's okay. Unfortunately, we've done our job very, very well with the current frame. People do think that composting is the answer, even after they've been told about the impacts of wasted food and the value of preventing that waste. And this is fascinating to me. It's a recent study that came out of Ohio State University that actually documented the impacts of framing the issue of food waste in terms of disposal. What they did at Ohio State is that they conducted a study where they gave groups of diners different information, and they were able to demonstrate that the diners who received information about the harms caused actually reduced their wasting of food by 77% over those who received alternative information that had nothing to do with food. However, once the researchers took that group of diners who received the education and divided them and told half of them that their waste would be composted, the prevention benefit completely disappeared. So once diners knew that their wasted food would be composted, they no longer were concerned about the fact that they were wasting it. This is a fascinating outcome because it confirms something that we've long thought here in Oregon, which is that recovery essentially gives people permission to waste food. And this is actually quite similar to other behaviors we've seen around recycling more generally, and which David already discussed. People kind of assume that it's okay to dispose of a material as long as it's recyclable. So at the risk of beating this dead horse, I decided to include this image just as an illustration of how far we've gone in the disposal messaging. And this is an actual flyer being used by a waste hauler here in the state of Oregon to inform residential consumers about what to put in their curbside bin or wasted food bin. What this leaflet clearly does is send a message to the public that whole pork chops, blocks of cheese, and muffins are fine to throw in your compost bin. It's just waste. Of course, we know that haulers don't want flyers to have a bunch of gross images like the picture I originally showed you at the beginning of this presentation. But surely we can find a way to tell people what it's proper to put in their compost bin without suggesting that, that food is waste and should just be tossed away. Telling people that the best thing they can do with food is that they could have eaten is to compost it is far from the best economic, environmental, or social solution. So what if we focused on a new frame, that the best thing you can do with food is to eat it, share it, and that you should compost whatever is left. Reduce wasted food, not divert wasted food. And so this actually gets us to our current work here in Oregon around creating a strategic plan for preventing the wasting of food. Because most solutions for wasted food have stuck us in the middle of the hierarchy at DEQ, what we really wanted to do was set about changing the conversation around this problem in ways that ultimately push us up the hierarchy to source reduction. In March of 2016, we started work to develop a strategic plan to guide our efforts over the next 5 years. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we're wrapping up that work and expect to present this plan in early February. But let's look at the plan itself. In thinking about how we can meet our objective, and as a basis for selecting our priority projects over the next 5 years, we established 3 high-level goals. One, and this is a hallmark of the way we do things here at DEQ, we wanted to be sure to develop the state of knowledge and to set up the building blocks to help reduce the wasting of food in Oregon and elsewhere in the most cost-effective and environmentally beneficial manner. It's also a goal of our strategic plan to actively increase business and consumer activity to prevent the wasting of food. And then lastly, and certainly not least, we want to contribute to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, water use, energy use, and wasted resources by reducing the generation of wasted, uneaten food by 15% by 2025 and by 40% by 2050. This last goal, the reduction goal, is aligned with our state's more general waste reduction goals updated in 2015, as David told you. So over the past months, while we developed the strategic plan, we've collected available information and we evaluated more than 80 potential projects before we settled on 9 overarching projects that are summarized in the plan and which will form the basis of our work over the next 5 years. These projects have, in some cases, several associated sub-projects, and I'm not going to march through each of them one by one, but I grouped them into specific areas. And where I wanted to start were several that focus on foundational research. And this is particularly important because we don't know a lot of what we need to know to fully respond to wasted food. And so we have a rather lengthy research agenda that we put together to help fill in some of the blanks about that state of knowledge and to help us get the building blocks we need to develop appropriate policy solutions. And I'm not going to march through each of these in turn, but I am going to touch on a couple that I think are of particular interest, and also a couple that we actually are starting quite soon. The first I want to talk about is the one at the top of the list, a measurement study. This work is being led by Ashley Zanoli, who is on detail to us, and we're lucky to have her on detail to us from EPA Region 10. Ashley is a nationally recognized expert in the wasting of food and how to solve that problem. And she's leading this measurement study, which we think will be groundbreaking, which will specifically identify the amounts of food wasted and the loss reasons associated with that waste. Recall that number that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, 25 to 40% of food being wasted in the U.S. That's a huge range, and that's because that estimate is an estimate. And what we're hoping out of this measurement study is to get a much better sense of what's actually happening when people waste food, and based on that knowledge, understand better interventions that could reduce their wastage. It's an awesome effort. It's being done in Portland in partnership with Portland State University, and it has started now and will be continuing for about the next 18 months. The second piece of research I wanted to talk about is a smaller scale study around the messaging of the wasting of food. As I mentioned again at the beginning of this presentation, we think words matter in this instance, and this is a sort of a piece of marketing research that will help us identify the language that is most effective in driving people to take action to reduce the wasting of food. I said I wasn't going to march all the way down the list, but it feels like I am, because I did want to touch a bit on food rescue. Food rescue is a complicated issue for us here in the state of Oregon. No one would deny that food that is edible and which others are not going to eat ought to be diverted to feed hungry people. It's a very worthy cause, and we agree. However, if you focus on food rescue as a means for preventing the wasting of food, we believe that could have certain perverse impacts on the way food rescue is conducted. So, for example, if you wanted to run a truck all over your city picking up the edible prepared food at every restaurant in the city and then deposit it at a local mission where people really need meals, you might be actually having a larger environmental impact through that transportation to pick up the food. In addition, that kind of approach to dealing with food waste might in fact generate food that's not fit to be rescued, to quote a local food bank. And so what our plan is with our strategic plan is to conduct some research around food rescue and really start to document what's effective food rescue and what's less effective food rescue, both from an environmental standpoint and also from a nutritional standpoint around the rescue of food. So the final piece of research that I want to talk about is further down the list. and it's some research that we want to conduct around the economics of food waste reduction. As some of you may have figured out, a fundamental assumption behind our emphasis on reducing the wasting of food upstream is that if that 25 to 40% of food currently wasted is not wasted, that somehow the production of food and its associated environmental impacts will decrease. We have reason to believe that farmers in the United States in particular would probably not be adversely impacted by the reduced demand for food that would result from effective prevention of waste. Instead, we think reducing the wasting of food would simply reduce the growth in food production necessary to meet rising populations and demand, and therefore slow the expansion of agriculture to marginal lands where environmental impacts might be even larger. So this research that we have planned would seek to confirm or disprove this thinking by looking at the impact that achieving wasted food reduction goals might have on farm incomes and other food-related industries, including addressing the question of whether the likely impact on food production might be, given the global nature of supply chains and the growing global demand for food. But our plan is not all about research. We have some other activities planned, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about those. The two major buckets are really around projects that are intended to ground test approaches or fill a clear need, building on the research that I just talked about. We have a plan based primarily on the work that will come out of the measurement study to develop commercial best practices. We think that this is a niche area that hasn't been well covered as yet. We also will be launching the development of some campaigns and working in school kitchens. And then the second bucket of projects we will engage in will build on and strengthen partnerships we have within our state and the region to help push food waste messaging into master recycler programs, for example, and through additions to outdoor school curricula. And then finally, we're working with the Pacific Coast Collaborative, a collaborative of California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia that's working on environmental issues. So where do we want to be at the end of all this 5-year plan? Oops. There we go. We want to be in this happy place where where households and businesses generate less wasted food by making shifts in how they manage their food and manage their homes. That we want to have measurable progress in reducing the wasting of food, that we've filled our research gaps and built a foundation for future activity in the state of Oregon, and that the conversation has been shifted, as I mentioned, such that policies intended to address the wasting of food in Oregon can be addressed with a fuller understanding of the implications of those interventions all along the life cycle of food. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and then open it up for more general questions.
Great. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for that beautiful picture that we're seeing right now. One question I had quite a few questions on was the distribution of wasted food. Is it in our homes? Is it in our retail stores? Is it our farms? And what of those, what's the answer and what are you focusing on?
That's a huge question.
Yes,
I don't have the data in front of me, but there's a large amount of food that's wasted in households and that's wasted in commercial kitchen operations. We know, I think, less specifically about the food that's really, the food that's literally wasted upstream. So, for example, ugly produce that farmers cull because it doesn't meet specifications for their grocer customers. We are focusing for the moment on what amounts to the more downstream portion of that entire waste generation cycle. So namely around consumers and around restaurants, in part because it's an area that is ripe with opportunity and where we can do some really important research, in particular that measurement study that I mentioned that Ashley's leading, to help point us in the right direction.
Great. We also had quite a few questions on the study that you mentioned from Ohio State, and I have to be honest, I have not heard of that. So can you just give us a citation or a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it was conducted by Brian Rowe and Danny Key at Ohio State. They've actually done a boatload of work around consumer attitudes around the wasting of food. And unfortunately, I don't have the direct citation in front of me, but I'm happy to provide it so it can be sent out to the group. That research, I believe, was only recently published, and I haven't actually looked at it in detail. I've only seen a summary of the outcomes.
Great. I look forward to seeing that as well. I have a lot of questions on the hierarchy, and I'm very hesitant to ask why anaerobic digestion and composting are linked where they are. If you have a quick answer to that, let's go there, and if not, we'll move on to another topic.
We're going to try to back up and pull up the hierarchy slide again.
Right. So this is David. In our hierarchy here, we've placed anaerobic digestion above composting, and we had commissioned, about 2 years ago now, a fairly major analysis. It was a harmonized literature review where we hired a team of contractors led by Jeff Morris, Dr. Sally Brown, some others, at Cotton, and Scott Matthews at Carnegie Mellon, who went through the published literature of life cycle assessments of end-of-life management options for food. So they looked at anaerobic digestion, composting, landfilling. They didn't look at incineration, but they looked at a fourth option, which we don't have on this graph, which was in-sink disposal. And what they were doing is they were looking for what the existing literature said about the relative environmental impacts of those four end-of-life management processes. You can't just compare the results out of the literature because every study uses different boundaries and assumptions. And so what our consultant team did is they deconstructed the 40 or so studies that were deconstructible and harmonized them so that they were using consistent assumptions. For example, we changed all the study results to be reflective of Oregon landfill conditions, and did other changes to make the results methodologically consistent. And that study demonstrated that anaerobic digestion, on average, and there's some error bars in this, but anaerobic digestion had definitely superior energy benefits compared to composting, and also appeared to have higher greenhouse gas reduction benefits than composting, which is actually contrary to the EPA WORM tool. But in this hierarchy, we're standing by our own analysis. And really, for us, the major aha of that study, prior to that study, we had been very conflicted about anaerobic digestion because we had heard from some folks in the composting industry that they saw AD as competing with them for feedstocks. Composting offered this soil carbon storage benefit. Well, we found a benefit from AD as well. So we now really don't discriminate between the two of them in terms of our preference. But that's kind of hard to show on a hierarchy, so we put AD above composting.
Gotcha.
Thanks.
Thank you, David. And then just give me a couple of examples of what you deem industrial uses.
So it's kind of gross. A lot of animal byproducts, not a lot. Some animal byproducts are kind of the obvious thing. Byproducts from animal slaughter that end up being used in other places.
Like makeup.
Like makeup. And I'm sorry?
Fats and greases.
Oh, and fats and greases that end up in industrial uses and are diverted. Those are the best ones. It's not a huge area, relatively speaking, I think, but it exists.
Great. Thank you so much. I did have a couple of questions, too, about the intersection on the food recovery for donation angle, with the caveat of not everything is equal and there's a social justice component to that. So I'm assuming you have partners in some of your work. Are you working with some of your other state agencies, or tell us how that's working in the state?
Absolutely. A significant partner in this work for us and a significant contributor to our knowledge as we put together the strategic plan was the Oregon Food Bank. And while the Oregon Food Bank is, of course, wholly in favor of rescue of edible food for feeding of hungry people, we also, it was really from the Oregon Food Bank that we started to appreciate the notion of food that's worth rescuing and food that's not worth rescuing. And so And there's a whole, I mean, all of the issues around food rescue get highly complicated when you start to talk about economics and food rescue organizations' own generation of wasted food. If you go to large food banks, like the Oregon Food Bank, you will see large bins full of the food they had to discard because it was either nutritionally not something they wanted to distribute. And what we're talking about here are things like, stale cupcakes and pans of French fries and so forth. And in some instances, their collection and management of these kinds of donations costs a lot of money, and it might in fact be more economically beneficial for food rescue organizations to simply purchase food rather than spend the money it takes to collect and distribute it. There are lots of excellent food rescue opportunities that produce nutritionally valuable food, direct rescue of fresh produce from farms, rescue of fresh produce and other fresh foods from grocery stores that might otherwise be discarded because they're approaching a point in their life where the grocery store no longer wants to sell them directly to customers. But it's a complicated issue, and our thinking about it is really just around the notion that if we cast rescue as an answer to the food waste problem, we're focusing solutions in the wrong place, and we may in fact be generating perverse solutions that cause more challenges for places like the food bank than they actually solve.
Yes, and I know here in the Boston Food Bank, as you probably know, Massachusetts has an organics ban for disposal, and they have very, very strict incoming standards just for that reason. And it's worked out pretty well for them, but they do indeed, turn away food if it's not up to their incoming standards. So I totally support that as well. David, I think we'll skip back kind of to the bigger picture, if that's okay for the remaining time. We have a lot of questions, and so for the folks on the webinar, I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we'll keep chugging along. One question I have a couple of times, David, is for those of us who are smaller governments or not-for-profits, we're focusing on waste diversion. And as you said, we're in kindergarten on the level of materials management. So what are the first steps that you would suggest to a smaller organization or someone that doesn't have your resources? What could they take away from today?
Alrighty, that's a great question. So look, the recovery of waste through recycling and composting and reuse even they're all environmentally valuable, beneficial, important activities. We need more of it, and we need it to be done better. So I don't want to suggest that every organization that has recycling as its mission drop that in favor of this big tent sustainable materials management approach, because we need people working and we need programs developing effective end-of-life solutions to discarded materials. So I think the first piece of advice I would ask would be to sort of get clear on what your organization's purpose is. I mean, there are a lot of cities, even some cities in Oregon, they're never going to do sustainable materials management writ large, because their job, their statutory job, and what their citizens expect of them is to make sure the garbage gets picked up. It's done by the Public Works Department, or it's overseen by the Public Works Department. They don't have a mandate to do broad environmental, action. And that's fine. Really, it is. But if your organization has a larger mandate, like sustainability or environmental protection, then you need to set aside, I think, some of what we believe and these beliefs that have been built up over the last 30 years, and take a critical, unbiased look at how do we achieve environmental outcomes over the life cycle of materials. And when you do that, you'll discover that some of the end-of-life programs we're doing are really good and should be continued, and some of them should be continued but just need to be tweaked a little bit. Like, for example, this issue that Elaine raised around food waste recovery. We're not proposing, I mean, even though there's this growing showing evidence that recovery gives people permission to waste food. We're not proposing that we just abandon food waste recovery. I mean, eggshells and banana peels are never going to be prevented, and keeping them out of the landfill through composting or AD is the best thing to do. But if your organization is charged with developing an effective recovery program, and by that I mean composting or AD, then we need to figure out how to do it and how to organize it and message it in a way that doesn't perversely undercut the hierarchy, that doesn't lead people to believe that it's okay to waste, and doesn't, as the Ohio study demonstrated, actually result in more wasting of food. So I think the recycling and recovery community really, if you really believe in the hierarchy and you really believe that prevention is best, probably the single most important thing the recovery community could do would be to really critically figure out how do we talk about recycling in a way that leads people to reduce first and then recycle what's left over. And it's our very strong suspicion, based on our review of a number of psychology and sociology studies, as well as sort of our, talking with just people on the street, that the frame of waste, framing this problem as a problem of waste, of evil landfills and waste avoidance, is one of the biggest problems. Because when people believe that the problem is a landfill problem, then the whole entire rest of the hierarchy is compressed like a pancake, and all the nuance, prevention better than reuse, reuse better than recycling, it's all lost because they all keep stuff out of landfill. And for that matter, recycling is kind of easy to do, and it's easy to see. I can even, it's like a badge of honor, and my neighbors see me do it because I put the stuff out on the street, and local governments build it. We have goals around it, and goals signal what's important. So we have this sort of collective myopia, I think, that's a consequence of this waste frame, and it really needs to be critically re-examined. I guess that would be the most important advice I could give.
Easy, right?
So easy. So easy, but EPA has charted the way with the road ahead, and for anyone who hasn't read it, it's a tremendously valuable document that didn't get the readership it deserved. Again, published in 2009. Check it out. There's some really, really great content in there.
And on that note, has Oregon taken on a outreach plan to engage with citizens and the public and elected officials to gain support for your vision and your framework?
Yes and no. I mean, the vision process was fairly broad. It had a lot of people involved in it, and obviously the legislative process was. We in the course of developing that legislation, I want to back up and say that Oregon is a fairly process-intensive state anyways when it comes to public policy. So, but we went, I mean, some people say we went overboard. I don't think we did, but we created an advisory group and 3 subgroups that had in total more than 100 stakeholders. They met 22 times to develop this legislation, just the legislative concepts, even before it got to the legislature. And we also took the concepts on a road show and visited almost every county in the state. So yes, we did quite a bit. We haven't really done that much in terms of the general population. And there are some reasons for that. One is we haven't had the resources to. Second is it's not DEQ's core function. Most communication around this topic is done by local governments. So we are developing, in the process of developing some materials, or plan to develop some materials that local governments can use in their public outreach efforts. But it's largely a resource issue. Our focus has been more on high leverage decision makers and businesses. An example of this would be a few years ago, we engaged in the Packaging Sustainable Value Network of Walmart, and the 100 or so hours that I spent on that effort leveraged far greater environmental outcomes than had I spent the same amount of time trying to figure out how to communicate this very, very complex issue to consumers. Mm-hmm. That's not really our emphasis, although we are in the process right now of hiring a dedicated communications and outreach specialist who will be doing some targeted work both towards consumers and businesses. So it is coming, but it's not what we led with.
Totally understand. Well, with that, we are out of time for today. So I would like to thank our speakers from Oregon DEQ and their cutting-edge work on the world of sustainable material management, consumption-based greenhouse gas analysis, and for all the kindergarten approach and how you're starting us down a path in this country. Finally, we want to thank most of all you for joining us for this month's SMM Web Academy, and hope you continue to join us if this program is designed for you. So please complete your evaluation, give us our feedback, how we can meet your needs. David, you have shared your contact information. I encourage folks to get in touch with you if they have specific questions, or please get in touch with me at EPA. Please, we'll post the webinar in about 2 weeks. And please join us for next month's webinar, where we shift back to taking on takeout trash and looking at our takeout habits in the retail sector. So with that, David, Elaine, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.